Thank you, Professor Telhami. Let me add my voice to that of the other speakers on the panel in thanking President Fernandez for the gracious invitation, for the generosity of your country. But let me also say that on behalf of myself and the other participants in the conference, we would like to thank the organizers of the conference, who from the youngest member of the staff to Ambassador Rahman, you have did a wonderful job the agenda, the program, and everything else. And I would be amiss if I didn't also thank the ambassador of the Dominican Republic in Egypt, Ambassador Bonetti. Mr. President, you have a great presentation in Cairo. She's very capable and a very reliable person. We have been invited by Professor Telhami to take a step back and try to think outside the, as important as it is, the issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I will address that in two sentences. The first is that I am not too old, but I am old enough to have a memory of a time when the word conflict in the Middle East was used to almost exclusively refer to the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Now that is not the situation. The Middle East is abound with conflict. You can only think of two wars going on in Iraq and in Afghanistan. You can think of tension over the Iranian nuclear ambitions. You can think of instability in countries east like Lebanon to south like Sudan, with the real possibility of a split of the south of Sudan. And God knows whether this will be the end or that will be just the beginning of new splits. And so now Middle East is a region that is going through turmoil. That, however, does not change the fact that the Arab-Israeli conflict remains, or the Palestinian-Israeli bit of it, as a matter of fact, remains, as Professor Telhami once described in one of his publications, as the prism of pain. This is the issue, the one single issue around which the Arabs and the Israelis, as a matter of fact, this is the one issue that defines their aspirations, their expectations, but at the same time, their disappointments, so on and so forth. And so while remaining aware of what's taking place in the larger picture in the Middle East, we should also realize that this is the one centerpiece of the Middle East puzzle. Other panelists have made reference to issues ranging from Iran and how it's changing the global dynamics and probably regional dynamics in a very serious manner. I will probably, because except for President Fernandez, I'm probably the youngest member on this panel. And so I will venture to say that the biggest story taking place in the Middle East right now is actually demographics. Populations. I will give you the example of my country, Egypt, for example. Right now, we stand at 56% of the Egyptian population are below the age of 25. And that can be two things. That can be a huge opportunity or a huge burden, depending on the decisions that we made, including how we're going to proceed with regards to the Arab-Israeli conflict. To complicate the picture a little bit further, and by the way, the Egyptian example is not an exception at all. It's actually, this is consistent throughout the Arab world. What makes the picture more complicated with the rise of this youth bulge in the Middle East is, and my friends Nadia and Rizkan will probably be happy to hear that, is the outburst of media outlets and telecommunication. People, the younger generation in Egypt and in other parts of the Middle East, now have their aspirations, their hopes, and their expectations for the future defined elsewhere. But also, they are immediately connected to the outside world. And I will just bring the example of the latest incident that took place close to Gaza, the Turkish boat. I would think 20 years ago, similar incidents would have taken place and nobody would have noticed. But right now, with the explosion of information technology, telecommunications, and media, globally and in the Middle East, even the smallest of incidents, like the Turkish incident, get the most attention. And it brings a lot of pressure on governments. One of the panelists before me mentioned that the absence of a resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict puts a lot of pressure on Arab governments, especially what we refer to as moderate governments. I will actually take that a step back and say that the combination of this youth bulge, the growth of population, especially the younger generations, combined with information technology and telecommunication, is making a lot of pressure on Arab governments. And I can tell you that the situation for some Arab governments is actually becoming truly untenable. The case of Egypt and the latest incident that took place is a very, very clear example. We are obsessed talking about Iran, so on and so forth, and we take almost as credited, almost as granted, that we will find Egypt, Jordan, and other Arab moderate countries always on the side of not rocking the boat, of not changing the game plan, while I think that there are changes, dynamics that are taking place in the region that can actually put enough pressure on Arab governments, including Egypt, to start questioning their premises. We're not there yet, but we are definitely proceeding in that direction. Now, from that global picture or macro picture, if you will, I want to focus a little bit on the Arab-Israeli conflict to suggest the following. I will, I hope, you see or here, I hope I would be as optimistic as you. But I will say the following. I will say that what we have right now in the Arab-Israeli conflict is truly a glass of water that is half full and half empty. It depends how you want to look at it. So on one hand, if you want to be optimistic, you can say the following things. You can say that we are closer today than any time before in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict to a clear definition and description of the main contours of what a settlement would look like. We're talking about a two-state solution. We're talking about a return of certain number of refugees just as a political symbol. We're talking about a shared sovereignty over the state, over Jerusalem. The contours are clear, at least clear in the minds of the vast majority of both polities, Israeli and Arab. But at the same time, you can look at it from a different angle and become very pessimistic and say that despite the clearness of the solution, we are further away from that solution than any time before. You can look at whichever direction you look. If you look to the Palestinian polity, as divided as it has never been, if you look to the Israeli polity, you will find that we are now dealing with probably the most hawkish, right to the center Israeli government ever. If you look to the United States, and I really sympathize with everything that was said about the efforts of President Obama, but at the same time, it remains true that President Obama raised expectations in my mind much beyond what he can actually achieve, taking into consideration the full plate that he was handed when he stepped into the White House the first day, both domestically and internationally. And so naturally, the Middle East peace process, for a lack of a better term, becomes the fifth or the sixth or even lower as a priority on American foreign policy. The one issue that I want a number of observations that I want to end with are the following. Number one, situation as it is right now is untenable. Number two, I am actually very pessimistic about the opportunities that present themselves in the short to mid-term. But here's the catch. A Middle East peace process, in my mind, is like a wheel that you're trying to push on top of a mountain. The only danger here is that if you stop pushing up, it will go down. So as bad as it is right now, if we don't continue to push, despite the fact that the environment might not be very suitable, despite the fact that major or key players are probably distracted in other directions, I know this as a fact of life, that if we don't use what we have in our hands right now, the situation is not going to get better. The situation is only going to get worse. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I turn to Mr. Ibish, our final speaker, I just want to make, I know you have been very patient, and we started late with the permission of the President, we are going to forego the break. We're also going to forego my own questions to the panel, and we'll go directly to the floor because I know you have not been engaged and you'd like to be engaged, and we'll use the rest of the session just to get questions from the floor and engage everyone in the group. So right after Mr. Ibish speaks, we'll open it up to the floor and have a discussion.
Thank you, Professor Telhami. And of course, I have to begin by echoing what all the other panelists have said all day long. My congratulations and thanks to President Fernandez, his hospitality and his visionary approach to engaging with this issue. It's extremely impressive, and thank you very much. I was asked by the organizers, who I'd also like to thank, to address very specifically the question of whether the two-state solution remains a viable outcome or not. That's one of the several questions that's been put generally in front of this conference, and they asked me to look at that very specifically. So I'm going to do that, and I have 8 points that I want to make, and I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. I'd like to start by noting that Mr. Al-Anani and also Akiva as well, in their own ways said, look, we have to keep believing in this. And there was some kind of almost moral imperative in their attitude towards the need not to let go of a belief in the potential of a two-state solution to work. And I want to make the case for why not only we have to, but why we should continue to believe in it as a viable political outcome and as a very real possibility. And I want to make the case about other ideas as well. The first point I want to make is a very simple proposition, which is that political realities are shaped by forces that produce outcomes, right? Social, political, economic, and military. Now that sounds like a ridiculously simple proposition, but if you read a lot of very sophisticated, prominent commentary on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you realize that a lot of people don't hold on to that principle. They forget about the forces that produce outcomes, and they start talking fancifully. They start talking imaginatively. They leave the realm of the real and start engaging in wild speculation. It's akin to science fiction, wherein you're no longer talking about facts, you're talking about something that you've imagined that can't possibly be realized. And I think you always have to ask anyone who comes with an alternative vision, how will that possibly be realized? And let me say that if there is a proposed outcome that one of the parties to any conflict that will have to agree to that outcome will not agree to it and cannot be militarily coerced into agreeing to it, then that is an outcome which we don't have to bother with. It's such a remote possibility that we needn't waste time either considering its virtues or value or striving to achieve it, because we simply will not. And I think we have to be very clear on that. So there are a whole host of alternative scenarios that fall into this category, right? The consolidation of a greater Israel, as it is now, with or without Gaza, is one. The idea, Hamas's idea of an Islamic state between the river and the sea is another. The democratic South Africa style, one man, one vote, one state solution for all of the Israelis and Palestinians plus all the refugees is another. Akiva mentioned the Israeli right, led by Moshe Arens and others, are starting to talk about their own version of a so-called one state solution, annexation of the West Bank, but not Gaza, nothing to do with the refugees, no agreement, and basically the East Jerusalemization of the West Bank. Essentially that. And of course, very foolish people, fantasists on the Arab one-state left have loved this and think it's the most wonderful thing ever, not realizing that what the settlers and their friends are talking about is making the occupation permanent. So that's really the first point, is that you've got to subject all proposed outcomes to that simplest test. And don't forget that it's dependent on forces that produce outcomes, and outcomes aren't produced by anything other than those forces. Now, I'd like to propose 4 very basic axioms that can guide us in this consideration of the continued viability of the two-state scenario and solution. The first is there is no military victory available to either Israel or the Palestinians. Neither party is going away. Neither party is going to achieve total dominance through military means. I think that has been well proven over the past 60 years. If it could have been done, it would have been done, and I don't see how it can. So I think plainly this has got to be resolved in a non-military way. So the second axiom is that therefore the conflict and the occupation can only end through an agreement. That's the only possibility. The third axiom is that there's no other way for both Israelis and Palestinians to secure their fundamental national interests. For Israel, it's security, acceptance in the region, etc. For the Palestinians, independence and freedom and the ability to form their own sovereign state. Neither of them can achieve either of those things by military means or any other means. They need an agreement with each other. They need the same thing for different reasons. They need it urgently. The fourth axiom is that the alternative to this agreement is continued occupation and conflict, because I don't see any other alternative. I look at the array of forces that produce outcomes, and I can imagine them readily producing a two-state agreement, and I can imagine them maybe even more readily not, and the situation continuing more or less as it is, and festering and deteriorating and continuing to get worse. Those are both serious, real, lively possibilities that can be produced by the forces that produce outcomes, and that really, I would say, are the choices. It isn't as if there's a smorgasbord of interesting options facing the Israelis and the Palestinians, as you might think if you read a lot of commentary on the issue. Not the case. I think it's a pretty stark binary. There's a fifth point, which doesn't rise to the level of an axiom, but it's so probable that it's close. I mean, it's avoidable, but not much. And several of the speakers have mentioned it, which is that in all likelihood, if we do end up with continued occupation and conflict, it is going to degenerate increasingly into a religious conflict, a holy war over God's will and sacred spaces led by fundamentalists and religious fanatics who are very well positioned in both societies, both in Israel and certainly among Palestinians, to lead this sacred conflict. And I mean, I think we can see exactly, for example, on the Palestinian side, where this will go. If over the next 10 to 15 years we do not achieve a peace agreement, and the state and institution building plan that Ziad was talking about collapses as well, and the entire strategy of the PLO just sort of falls apart and loses all credibility, well, I think we can say with a great deal of confidence who's likely to inherit leadership of the Palestinian National Movement. It's Islamists led by Hamas. It's not any Gandhian one-state group or a Nelson Mandela-like gang of characters. There they are. They're waiting in the wings. They've got a strong constituency. We don't, we really don't have to, not only we don't have to imagine, you shouldn't bother imagining fictional alternative leaderships when the alternative leadership is there and clearly there. I think you can see similar trends in Israeli society towards increased fundamentalism and increased religious fanaticism, and the increased tendency to cast this conflict as a religious conflict, on both sides. The fourth point that I want to make is that this two-state agreement is still viable in spite of the obstacles, primarily because it's so deeply in the interests of both parties. As I said, they can't achieve their most fundamental national requirements any other way. So even if either one of them or both of them behaves in a completely irrational manner and refuses to do the only thing that can provide them what they need at the most fundamental level, it will still be the case that it is in their basic interest to do it. And it's not in their enlightened interests. It's in their immediate, obvious, present, pressing interests. So, for example, among Israeli officials and quasi-official discourse right now, there's there's a debate about whether Iran is the biggest threat, or delegitimization of Israel is the biggest threat, or is the continued occupation, the continued conflict the biggest threat. Well, it's all the same thing, after all. Because what gives Iran an excuse to be confrontational with Israel with any credibility at all, and to support clients who are directly antagonistic to it, like Hamas and Hezbollah? It's the occupation. Exactly, it's the occupation. Same thing with delegitimization. What do people who engage in, let's say, I mean, there's a potpourri, but let's say things that really are efforts to delegitimize the state of Israel and try to promote replacing it with something else, it's the occupation. It all comes back to the occupation, whether people realize it or not. The fifth point is that the international community and the United States have a very powerful interest in this. And Professor Telhami asked about incentive structures for the United States. I'd say, ask me about this, because I'd like to talk about the new understanding of regional strategic realities that have led the United States in this position. I have 3 points. I'll make them in 1.5 minutes. One is that all the obstacles to peace that are cited by opponents of the two-state solution are functions of political will. They are things like settlements, the wall, etc., are realities that exist because people decided to create them. And whatever people have decided to create for political reasons, they can decide to uncreate for political reasons. We know settlements can be evacuated. They were in Gaza and the northern West Bank. Walls have come up, walls have come down all over the world. Sorry? All right. Sorry? Okay. Yeah, and Yamid also. Thank you. So the real metric which I proposed in my book on the subject is not the topographical and administrative changes imposed in the occupied territories by the occupation, but the political will. If the political will is there, there is a possibility to do it. The political will is reflected in polling among Israelis and Palestinians, and I would say one can start to think about seriously giving up on a two-state solution if most people on both sides no longer reflect any interest in it. But as long as they do, it's still possible, and you can't give up on it because the alternative is so dire. Thank you.
Thanks, Hussein. I'm going to turn to the floor, and please, if you can, make your questions specific. And the questions could be addressed to the morning panel as well as the afternoon panel, so we can have a full discussion. Please.
During the discussion this morning, Colette made a comment about the fact that Israel or Israelis live under an existential fear. And a number of speakers have also mentioned the fact that events in the Middle East could degenerate into religious conflict. And I've been sitting here wondering whether perhaps we need to consider, or actually there's a question, whether there could be any opinions about whether we should look at the conflict in the Middle East as having had, to a large extent, a religious origin. Clearly, it is not an accident that Jewish people have felt persecuted for the past 2,000 years. Western Christendom, Western Christian intolerance in the Middle Ages led to the dispersal of Jews throughout Europe, and eventually their removal from Europe all the way to into Eastern Europe. And so my question is whether it may not make sense that perhaps religious leaders, places of worships, mosques, churches, synagogues should not have leaderships where the discourse has to deal more with trying to perhaps redefine the common links that bind Jews, Jews with Christians, Christians with Muslims, instead of simply assuming that perhaps political opinion alone will change things in the Middle East.
Is this specific to anyone in particular?
Well, Colette mentioned this, and perhaps the last speaker also can take that question.
Anyone wants to take that up? Okay. Please, anyone else? Yeah. Please.
Thank you. I would like to ask the panel to try to find if there is a new way to negotiate that gives a real practical solution as an intellectual exercise. New ideas, how to conciliate, to build trust. Maybe a new way, a new state with conditions that give security of future for both sides. We know the failing history of all negotiations, how we can end this. The Latin American community is now a new player. President Fernandez knows that the Arab and Jewish communities can give a clear example that we can live in peace together. We trust each other together. We work together. Can we do it there? Let's be practical. Thank you.
You identify yourself, and everyone else after that, please identify yourself.
I am Shauki Ajami from Colombia.
Pleasure. Anyone wants to? Akiva.
Shibley, you mentioned the phrase trust, which was mentioned again. I think that what I suggest is to rephrase it. Instead of trust, common interests. We don't have time to build trust. For 100 years, we did everything to destroy any chance of trust. We don't have another 100 years to rebuild it. So I think that it's so clear, and it's much easier to convince people in the win-win game that the Middle East can benefit from peace. Not only benefit, this is the only way, as Hussein mentioned, to contain the fundamentalists is, I don't think that the Iranians really care about the Palestinian. I think that they're just exploiting the misery of people in Gaza, as well as others. So what I suggest is to have the next meeting here, next year, with representatives from countries who are members of the Arab League, but are, as I mentioned before, but are avoiding to meet Israelis in order to convince the Israelis not only that you can trust the Arabs, but that we can build a different alliance that is built on common interests to contain the enemies of the pragmatic regimes. I think this is, Mr. President, your next challenge.
Thank you. I think I would like to take the point of Akiva on the issue of trust, because I think that it has become a problematic term, you know, trust-building measures, because, first of all, confidence-building measures, and also building trust through confidence-building measures, simply because, you know, somehow they develop a world of their own that is sidelining the whole debate from its main course. And they develop a dynamic of their own. But I think that what we need to do is to look at a more enlightened approach of what we think is the future should be, and then begin to behave in a way that would somehow strengthen our recourse during the negotiation process itself. Not that I don't like to see more humanitarian relations, you know, for instance, or release of prisoners or anything like that. These are important steps. But what I was saying is that we spend so much time debating what those confidence-building measures to the point that we are wasting very valuable time. And so where do you draw the line between the two? Thank you.
Ziad,
okay. I suggest that we do without the trust altogether and resort to something more important, which is enforceable agreements that are enforced and guaranteed by other parties. I think there is no time for one thing, and one of the major failings of past agreements was the lack of implementation and accountability in a very detailed manner. I think this has to be included on two levels. One, in the upcoming negotiations, whenever they take place, and agreements if they are ever signed. Secondly, by the ongoing program of getting things done on the ground at all levels, by also international supervision and holding parties accountable for what they do now, including a code of conduct that is clearly stated.
Before I turn to the lady for a question there, Yossi Bellin has a comment to make, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment to the brilliant analysis of Hussein. I really subscribe to all what you said about the two-state solution. But I would not omit another option, which is unilateralism. The temptation in the Israeli right to unilateralism has not died. And people like Sharon, or even Olmert at the beginning, Olmert was elected on the notion that he will continue the legacy of Sharon in the West Bank. He went to Britain when he was elected, a few weeks after that, met with Tony Blair and told him publicly that he was ready to withdraw from 90% of the West Bank unilaterally because these people are not ready to pay the price in Jerusalem and even a symbolic solution for the refugees. So I believe that there is a possibility that if the world understands, once it happens, that there is a majority of Palestinians dominated by a minority of Israelis, and the Israeli Prime Minister belongs to the right, he might say, okay, what I need is a border, not necessarily a Palestinian state, and I have this border. And this is the news here. There is a border, it is the fence or the wall, and the future Prime Minister knows already, whoever he is, that he will withdraw unilaterally to the wall. And this is why the two-state solution is not necessarily the only option.
No, I understand, and I've actually written about that. I've described it as Israel's nuclear option because it would be extremely risky for the Israelis to do, particularly vis-a-vis peace treaties with Israel and Jordan, which it would violate completely. And what then would happen in the West Bank, etc., and Gaza, and it would be a very dangerous thing for the Israelis to do. They might do it. Here's the question: would it end the conflict? I think the answer is plainly not. Would that? Well, exactly. So it's not. Again, it's not an alternative solution. It's just a measure that Israel might take, and it would take the conflict into a whole nother realm. But it wouldn't end it.
We'll go back to the floor, and please identify yourself.
Sí, gracias. Mi nombre es Farideh Serán. Soy periodista, escritora académica de Chile. Chile es un país que tiene una de las colectividades palestinas de origen palestino más grande del mundo fuera de la del Medio Oriente. Me parece que quiero felicitar al presidente. Realmente este es un encuentro bastante importante. Creo que es un encuentro sin precedente en América Latina. Pienso que efectivamente América Latina tiene una palabra que decir en torno al tema de la paz en el Medio Oriente, sobre todo cuando vemos que han fracasado otras instancias tan importantes. Mi pregunta y reflexión tiene que ver con estos términos que han surgido y a mí un poco me produce temor, no desconfianza, porque creo que el concepto de confianza se destruyó entre palestinos e israelíes hace muchos años. Creo que lo que aquí hace falta efectivamente es ver la paz como un gesto político y reconstruir desde la nada. Mi pregunta tiene que ver con dos hechos que son fundamentales. Uno, el surgimiento aquí permanente que está rondando, y es la creación de dos estados palestinos, uno de Hamas y otro de la OLP. Eso que está rondando me parece brutal, me parece salvaje y me parece que de alguna forma no está dando cuenta de la responsabilidad que existe en torno al surgimiento de los integrismos, tanto por el lado palestino como por el lado israelí, ¿no?, de los actores tradicionales que han hecho de Israel y han hecho de Palestina lo que hoy día es. Yo quisiera saber, me gustaría escuchar en este debate qué reflexión se pueden hacer los actores tanto israelíes como palestinos de que hoy día la palabra paz o entendimiento sea solo parte de una minoría en Israel o de una minoría, de un sector cada vez más minoritario en el pueblo, en parte del pueblo palestino. ¿Qué ha pasado para que efectivamente estemos en este nivel? Creo que eso es un buen punto para saber por qué han fracasado las negociaciones. Gracias.
I'd just like to say that I totally agree with what Ashraf said, that we have to keep pushing the wheels up, because if we don't, the wheels will come down, and they'll come down to hurt all of us. And I totally agree that the polls now, and Dr. Shibley, that's what you do partially for living, you can see clearly that the polls, even in countries like Egypt and Jordan, who are very moderate, are actually very negative towards the process, towards Israel, and towards the entire marketable peace process. And I call it that because I'm a businessman, and I did this study to see how many times we changed the brand of peace. And it's nearly about 38 times that we've given it different names, from call it shuttle diplomacy back in the 70s, to Camp David Treaty, to Y River 1, Y River 2, Camp David 2, Camp David 3, to proximity talk, to direct talk, to Mitchell Plan, to roadmap, endless in Annapolis, just so many names. And where I come from as a businessman, I think that's genius, the genius of branding. And there are some great people in Washington who come up with these great brands, and it's fantastic. I mean, it's very good. It's just like Gucci and Cartier. They have to keep producing. They have to keep doing. And Ziad knows. I mean, it's not about really getting anywhere. It's just about keeping the process going. So the message here is, it is dangerous, because people like Ashraf and myself, and I remember in Miami in '84, I was invited to a conference by the chairman of the Royal Caribbean, and he invited me just for one reason, to say that I was the product of peace. And so that was my belief with Mrs. Sadat, because it is true that in 1984, if it wasn't for Sadat and if it wasn't for Egypt making peace with Israel, I definitely would not have been able to be in Miami, nor even in 2010 to be in the Dominican Republic. The likelihood of me serving in the army until now was probably very high by the definition of Egypt of Dr. Abdullah's former generation, as he said it. And I certainly don't want to see my kids, after 20 years from now, going into what my parents went through. But if we keep on playing and we keep on just looking at branding and creating all these great slogans, I think sadly we might see ourselves going back. We absolutely might see ourselves going back. So thank you.
Anyone wants to comment
on the issue of Hamas? On the issue of Hamas, if I just may say, on Gaza, I think basically in Gaza there was a violent takeover of the country, regardless of previous elections, which don't hold to anybody anyway. In a strategic sense, we do not think that there is a great deal of concern about the future of Gaza, for a simple reason, that Israel does not want it. It has already left it. And the second reason, equally strong, is that Egypt will not accept it. It will just not have it as part of Egypt in any way, shape, or form. Gaza cannot stand alone as an independent country. It is not Singapore. So in the future, it has to be part of the West Bank and the Jerusalem new entity, which is the solution that seems to be unavoidable, the only one that qualifies as a solution. So the present circumstances are such that Gaza rejoining with the West Bank in any kind of a formulation cannot work because of the security arrangements that have transpired already in Gaza and the West Bank.
Is it on the same issue, and then we'll go to the floor back? Go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to add say a few words. Look, in the end of the day, along the years, and I am part of the process since the Madrid conference, I think all the problems were on the tables, solutions are there, and either with Yossi's Geneva initiative or other groups, Israel Clinton program. Look, nothing is new. The problem is that you need brave leaders to take decisions. That's the basic problem. Now, the question is how to bring those leaders to take those tough decisions. You have to be a strong leader. A strong leader is someone which leans in a democracy on a broad support of the people, which enables him to take decisions. At the moment, at least in the Israeli case, that's not the situation. And a weak dictator, a weak democrat, which has to wake up every morning and to think, who shall I please today in order to keep my coalition, cannot take brave decisions. He can take the lowest common denominator as far as decisions are concerned. And we should ask ourselves, how do we help such leaders to take decisions? And I think that's the name of the game. And the name of the game is to recruit the support of the people, which will enable leaders to take decisions. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves in a situation in which we are sitting here next year and the year after with leaders which are not able to take decisions. And that will bring us nowhere.
I'm going to go take a question from the floor. Please identify yourself.
Okay. Víctor Atala, Dominican Republic, República Dominicana. Antes que nada, felicitar al señor presidente. Me siento orgulloso de ser dominicano hoy. Siempre me he sentido, por hoy más. La verdad que mi padre, que es palestino y falleció, hubiera estado hoy muy contento de saber que en República Dominicana se está dando este tipo de evento en el cual se busca mejorar la condición de su país y de una parte muy importante del mundo. Aparte de la historia de las religiones, he notado muy poco, o no he notado, que quizás no se ha hablado del aspecto humano. Yo como médico sé que el aspecto humano es importantísimo y sé que mejorar la condición de vida de las personas que están en el conflicto ayuda mucho a que se solucionen muchos de los problemas. Yo conozco a muy pocas personas que estando tranquilos y contentos sean capaces de ser víctimas de extremistas o de grupos que quieran influenciar de una forma u otra la forma de pensar. Y yo pienso que quizás una de las cosas más importantes que podría hacer este tipo de evento es crear algún tipo de subcomité o capítulo que busque unir las diásporas de diferentes países y quizás canalizar muchas de las entidades caritativas y entidades que ayudan a mejorar las condiciones de los humanos a que garanticen que las personas que están en el conflicto, las personas que pueden estar neglectas, consigan una calidad básica de vida suficiente para que puedan por lo menos pensar en un futuro y no tener siempre dentro de ellos solamente el sentimiento de odio o de malestar. Quizás de aquí pueda salir la formación de subcapítulos, de comités que ayuden a identificar diásporas, que ayuden y canalicen las ayudas para que no pasen eventos como lo que pasaron recientemente, en el cual un barco de ayuda no pudo penetrar a llevar ayuda a los sectores que necesitaban en Palestina por limitaciones. El aspecto humano, el hombre cuando se siente contento o por lo menos útil o con una esperanza, se aparta mucho del odio y olvida mucho la historia y las diferencias. Y quizás yo quisiera traer esta idea al panel para que quizás de aquí se busque algún tipo de organización o de organización multilateral en la cual se organice, valga la redundancia, algún tipo de esfuerzo para garantizar que las partes que están privadas tengan por lo menos condiciones básicas de vida, que garanticen que no sean víctimas de estos grupos extremistas que se aprovechan de esto para así perpetuar este tipo de crisis. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for your comments. Before we go to Mr. Abdullah on the panel, I'd like to take one more question. One more question from the floor, please.
Yes. Gabriel Bannon. We have heard all the day everyone explaining the condition of the negotiation, and it seems that everyone found solution, but we still, it's 20 years that we are going from negotiation to negotiation. And as Danny Rothschild say, it's a couple of minutes. What we need is a real strong government that can go through a real negotiation. But perhaps we are wrong completely. Perhaps it's not the way. It's not negotiation that from where we will have a solution. And perhaps we have to be a little creative and go to other solutions. And shall we start from come back to the beginning? In the beginning, it was no negotiation to create Israel. It was a decision from UN, United Nations. So perhaps we have to come back to the United Nations and they have to take new decision creating the state of Palestine. And that for that we will not need any more strong government, courageous men from each side. Perhaps we are wrong. Perhaps it's not the way to go through negotiation. And perhaps it's better that it will be imposed by the international community.
Well, very interesting comments. Why don't we turn to Mr. Abdullah?
Thank you, Professor Telhami. I just wanted to answer the question of Gaza. First of all, it is true, and I was a witness personally in 1980 when Menachem Begin was in Alexandria and we were in Ma'mura with late President Sadat, and he told President Sadat, when we withdraw, we will give you Gaza back. And Sadat answered on the spot, Gaza is a Palestinian land. You want to give it back to the Palestinian. It is not an Egyptian land. I want my land and not 1 millimeter more than my land. They tried the same with President Mubarak during the achievement of the withdrawal when we had the Taba agreement. The position was the same, and it will remain the same. This is a Palestinian land. So Egypt will achieve its responsibility to facilitate, the life of people, but never, and this also some extremists now in the Israeli government are dreaming again about a kind of transfer in the Sinai and so on. We are respecting the right of the Palestinian people's legitimate right of the Palestinian people. The second problem, when we come, okay, it is not a secret, we are in favor of the actual Palestinian core, the majority. We are not against Hamas, but the problem for us is the decision of Hamas is not taken in Gaza. The decision of Hamas is taken elsewhere. I think it is not, everybody knows the secret. I don't have to mention where it is taken. So this reminds me, and just for 1 minute, was the historical mistake which has been made in Sudan. And I remember 10 years ago, I was discussing with an eminent, a key politician in Sudan. I was discussing with him, telling, take care, you are going to lose the south of Sudan. His answer was, keeping the north of Sudan under Islamic rule is better than keeping a unified Sudan which is not under Islamic rule. So I'm scared that this is the concept of the people who are leading Hamas and leading Gaza today. Thank you.
Can I address the comments?
I think Colette
sure.
is there first.
Sure, sorry.
Two very short comments. One, to add perhaps one more axiom to what Hussein has put as almost 5 axioms, and that is that so far the conflict has been about national identities as well. And the idea of any other solution than the two-state solution, let's say the one-state solution, does not take into account that still the strongest need of both populations is to assert their national identities and their national pride. So I think that this is something very axiomatic which no other solution can take into account. This is number one. And number two, a short answer to Mr. Bannon. I can hear in your voice that you're exasperated and let's already have a Palestinian state. And I think we all wish we were there. But I think that if the United Nations unilaterally declares a Palestinian state or tries to impose a solution, this will not end the conflict. And one of the purposes is not only to have a Palestinian state, but to have a Palestinian state that has borders that are agreed upon, where we can solve the solutions, where the refugees have a solution and so on. So that, I think, cannot be done unilaterally, and therefore I don't think it's feasible.
I completely agree with that, and if I might add.
Mr. Swelm was there before, but why don't you, since you're responding to it directly, why don't you go ahead? Yeah.
Okay, well, I just wanted to add, I mean, think it through, sir, for a second. Israel was not created when the United Nations partition resolution was passed. Israel was created by a war, which started a conflict which has not ended. So, in fact, it was created by military force. And that's what created. The UN may have given it legal sanction, both the partition resolution and then by accepting Israel as a member state afterwards, but that's what happened. If the UN passed a resolution, I think as Ms. Avital has pointed out, it would require it to either be agreed to by Israel, in which case we're talking about an agreement again, or, and hence negotiations, or it would have to be enforced militarily by some means. So, I mean, there is no, my point is there's no way out of this trap. There's no way out of this conundrum. It's many people are driven in a very understandable way to say, I have to think outside the box. I can't take it anymore. 20 years of banging my head against this wall, and it's just pointless, it's hopeless. I have to get out of this negotiation, so out of this two-state stuff. There isn't anything outside the whale except conflict and occupation and worse that we've been describing. Unfortunately, and if someone ever comes up with a good idea, I'll be amazed to hear it, but I've never heard anything that even comes close.
Thanks. Before we go to Mr. Swelm,
I just want to make a couple of comments. One is about Gaza. Actually, Gaza cannot be a state on its own, and it is not going to be. And everybody knows that. Neither the Egyptians nor the Palestinians. Those who speak about the potential for Gaza to be a state are really using that as a pretext in order not to move forward on the issue of the peace process. And it is not, and by the way, Gaza is not an Israeli problem, if it is a Palestinian problem. And I'm sure that the solution to Gaza problem can be achieved through the success of negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and not a vice versa. It is not a precondition for the successful of the negotiations, but the success of negotiations can solve the Gaza problem. This is one. The other issue which I personally, as someone who has been a participant and close to the negotiations, I came to the conclusion, maybe wrongly so, that bilateral negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis are not going to produce a settlement on their own. It is quite impossible for the many reasons, mainly the asymmetry. I am sitting here with prominent Israelis on equal footing. I go to the West Bank, and in order to cross the bridge, any Israeli soldier can prevent me from going into the Palestinian territories. any Israeli soldier, or not even a soldier. Abu Mazen, who is Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, in order for him to move from his house to go to Jordan, he needs the permission of the Israeli army. He cannot do it on his own. So, I mean, that's why we are talking about the importance, in fact, a condition sine qua non for the success of negotiations is to have the involvement of the third party. And I don't want to say here it is the United Nations or China or the Dominican Republic or the United States. But this third party has to be really serious and willing to be actively involved. If it is the United States, let it be. But we cannot keep talking about the bilateral negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and they are on themselves can produce a peaceful settlement. I personally came to the conclusion that they cannot on their own, the Palestinians and the Israelis, reach an agreement. And that's why it is essential to have the involvement of the third party. Unfortunately, and I've lived in Washington for a long time, and many of you know Washington well, there are political realities in Washington that prevent the United States administration from playing that role. There's no substitute for the United States? Maybe. Because it is not the will of President Obama alone. We know that there are other forces. There's the Congress of the United States. The other day when Mr. Obama made his statement in relation to the settlements, whether it was a wise statement or unwise, as some may suggest, many congressmen went to Mr. Obama and told him that he was wrong, and he should have not. And he should not quarrel with the Prime Minister of Israel. That is a reality. So it is not out of the logic for Mr. Bannon to speak about the United Nations, because out of a frustration with the negotiations that have not produced the outcome that needs, and you know, when we formulated the questions, because really there has been so many peace initiatives starting from Rogers in 1970 up to now, and everybody knows what are the terms of the agreement, yet somehow we are unable to connect. And that was the question that we needed to answer here today, or address. What needs to be done differently, not in the same way it has been done before, in order for us to move forward. And this is really the essence of this exercise that we are having here today. How can we do things differently, not in terms of only the substance, but also the approach to the negotiations, so that we can produce something different, something more tangible for the people concerned. Thank you.
Thanks. I will turn to Ashraf. I think I know we started late and there's a lot to be discussed, and I'd like to give the final word to the President. So
I want to address the last two questions from the gentleman and from the lady. And I will say the following, that they both have one thing in common, is that they actually present us with the tough choices that we have to take. For the gentleman's question, I think the one party that can actually make such a unilateral declaration of the establishment of the Palestinian state is the Palestinians themselves. But the reality of the matter is, when such attempts took place, now going back to Ambassador Rahman's comments, the movement in Congress was actually to put forward legislation not to recognize the Palestinian state if at the time, President Arafat, or I'm not sure why, I think it was President Arafat, declared the establishment of a Palestinian state. So that's the tough reality that we need to face. The second question about, the lady's question about the Palestinian factions. I'm sorry, this is the reality. And that's why I say I'm very, very skeptical when it comes to, while it's very tempting to say, interim agreements are dead, let's just jump to the final status negotiations. And I would say, and what do you do about the divisions within the Palestinian camp? Which again presents you with a very difficult question. In my mind, in order to move forward in a constructive way, Palestinian polity needs to be addressed as much as our second panelist talked about addressing the Israeli public, which I think you cannot achieve anything if you don't have the Israeli public on your side. And I think President Obama made a huge mistake when he thought that just coming out in public and saying the settlements need to stop without making sure, in a very similar way to what President Bush Sr. did, that he has the Israeli public on his side against Prime Minister Shamir, he was never going to succeed. The same we face with the Palestinian factions. But here are the tough choices again. In order to have proximity talks between the Palestinian factions, you will need to wait for years until these talks produce a result, because for all practical purposes, the only thing that would allow it to happen is to basically bring down all the rules of Palestinian polity and establish completely new rules. And the question that I will put to all the other panelists and to everybody in the room, are we willing to wait that long? That's the first way of saying it. But in a second way, we can ask the question, well, we afforded to wait for 60 years, so maybe you can wait for another 20. These are the choices that we face day in and day out in making any decisions regarding the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Thank you. I know that there are a lot of people who want to make additional comments, and this is, of course, not going to be the end of the conversation today. We're going to have another day, and some of the same issues are going to come up. So what I would like to do is turn the floor over to the President for final remarks. Thank you so much for this enlightening conversation, and certainly this conversation will continue tomorrow as well, and those who wanted to say more, I think will have a chance to do so. Thank you again, Mr. President, for joining us and hosting us, and I turn the floor to you.
Well, thank you so much. And on this occasion now, I will shift into Spanish to make this overview, so you can put up your headphones and get the translation. Bien, quisiera en estos momentos empezar por felicitar una vez más a los distintos panelistas por sus brillantes intervenciones que nos han enriquecido para comprender mejor la realidad del conflicto entre Israel y Palestina y toda la situación del Medio Oriente. Y agradecer también las amables palabras que han tenido para la República Dominicana y el papel que eventualmente puede ejercer en promover un clima de paz en la región del Medio Oriente entre Israel y Palestina, e Israel y todo el mundo árabe. Creo que este panel es de una riqueza realmente impresionante. Creo que todos los temas actualmente en conflicto en la región han sido presentados de una manera muy clara y muy comprensiva. Y creo que hemos ido de alguna forma resolviendo algunas de las interrogantes que se han planteado. La interrogante de si todavía es viable una solución de dos estados, Israel y Palestina, y hemos ido resolviendo de qué ha tenido éxito y qué ha fracasado en los distintos procesos de paz que ha habido en los últimos 60 años. Lo que nos queda por resolver todavía es la interrogante planteada por el embajador Hassan Ram, en el sentido de qué cosa diferente habría que hacerse en estos momentos para poder garantizar la paz. Y en ese sentido, lo que hemos escuchado esta tarde de parte de los distintos panelistas es estableciendo una especie de analogía con la historia de dos ciudades de Dickens, es que estamos en el mejor de los momentos para alcanzar la paz y estamos al mismo tiempo en el peor de los momentos para alcanzar la paz. Y ahí es donde radica quizás la complejidad y la dificultad de esta situación. Se simplifica por el hecho de que por primera vez ya se sabe exactamente qué es lo que tiene que resolverse. Hubo una época en que no había suficiente claridad conceptual para saber qué era lo que se discutía. Hoy ya se sabe. Hoy lo que se sabe es que Israel exige seguridad para garantizar su subsistencia como Estado, que Palestina está solicitando la devolución de territorios que le correspondían desde antes de la guerra de 1967. Es muy claro. Se está discutiendo el estatus de Jerusalén, se está discutiendo el tema relativo a los refugiados palestinos. El tema resulta claro, por vez primera, y se ha establecido una carta de ruta para ir resolviendo estas dificultades. Y se han señalado aquí tendencias, ¿no? Tendencias que hoy día podemos observar en el Medio Oriente, en la región, que tiene que ver con la emergencia, por ejemplo, de Turquía, como una nueva fuerza regional, que tiene que ver con Irán, también como una potencia regional que hoy se presenta como una amenaza a la estabilidad de la región y de manera especial como amenaza a la seguridad interna de Israel. Y eso nos lleva entonces a la interrogante de qué es lo prioritario en estos momentos. Si lo prioritario es manejar la situación potencialmente conflictiva con Irán, o sigue siendo una prioridad el tema Israel-Palestina, Israel-mundo árabe en la solución del conflicto. ¿Qué es lo prioritario en estos momentos? Pero al mismo tiempo estamos viendo tendencias políticas internas de los actores en conflicto. Por una parte, en el caso de Israel, el predominio en estos momentos de una tendencia política ultraconservadora, que tiene una visión de crear dificultades hacia el logro de una paz duradera. Pero del lado de Palestina, una división en el mundo palestino, la autoridad palestina con la Organización de Liberación Palestina y el grupo Fatah en la margen occidental, y por otra parte un grupo ya radical, islamismo radical, Hamas, gobernando en el área de Gaza. Entonces, lo que estamos viendo aquí es la parte de la dificultad. Los palestinos divididos, con un ala radical activa, en Israel dominando una derecha. Ahí encontramos el problema de los actores. Los temas resultan claros, los actores dificultan arribar a una situación de paz. Ya lo decían, el tema no es de los tópicos a tratar, es de los actores que deben intervenir. Entonces ahí hay un problema de corto plazo que se combina además con el hecho de que el actor externo fundamental en la zona, que son los Estados Unidos, con la llegada del presidente Obama, produce un cambio de percepción en el sentido de que siempre se había visto a Estados Unidos como muy alineado a favor de Israel, y el presidente Obama ahora genera expectativas en el mundo árabe de que podrá abordarse el conflicto desde una perspectiva más equitativa. Pero resulta que esas expectativas del presidente Obama, 18 meses después de haberse iniciado su mandato, no se han concretizado en acciones efectivas. Y ahora estamos ante la inminencia del ciclo electoral norteamericano. Ahora se está a la espera de qué va a pasar en las elecciones congresionales del mes de noviembre, para saber entonces qué ocurrirá en la segunda mitad de su mandato. Y por tanto, aquí estamos entonces con un problema de tiempo limitado para poder resolver la situación, pero con los actores menos calificados para avanzar en la solución del conflicto, jugando justamente al ciclo electoral norteamericano para saber en qué dirección se puede caminar. Pero hay cosas que ya se han dicho aquí que sabemos. No hay solución militar al conflicto. Por tanto, tiene que haber necesariamente un acuerdo pactado, tiene que haber una negociación que termine en un pacto. Pero si seguimos el mecanismo tradicional, convencional que se ha seguido, parece que no arribaremos a resultados. ¿Cuáles son algunas de las experiencias positivas que hemos tenido en procesos de paz? Bueno, hemos visto que Israel y Egipto lograron firmar un acuerdo de paz. Luego, esto se puede presentar como un éxito histórico. En la historia ya conocemos un caso donde hubo un acuerdo de paz. Se suscribió un acuerdo de paz entre Jordania e Israel. Por tanto, lo ha habido. Habría que pensar entonces en un acuerdo de paz entre el Líbano e Israel, un acuerdo de paz entre Siria e Israel, para completar el cuadro de los vecinos más próximos, que no se está planteando en estos momentos y que sería importante porque Hezbollah ha estado actuando desde el Líbano en confrontación con Israel y como aliado de Hamas, con la presunta ayuda de Irán en este caso, de manera que son parte de un conflicto mayor. Entonces, sí ha habido ejemplos de éxito con Egipto, con Jordania. Si lo de Oslo lo podemos presentar como un éxito, porque se avanzó en presentar el diagnóstico del problema, en definir el cuadro de la situación y poder avanzar. De lo que se trata entonces, a nuestro modo de ver, siguiendo la interrogante suscitada por el embajador Hassan, de qué cosa diferente puede hacerse en el futuro para ir avanzando en la única solución real posible que esto tiene, que es la solución negociada. Yo diría que hay que hacer un ejercicio de construcción de escenarios posibles de cómo se debe actuar. Si en Oslo dio resultado el approach de que fuera en forma clandestina, de que no tiene que hacerse en forma pública, ¿por qué quizás no ensayar en estos momentos una manera no pública de ir discutiendo estos temas? Quizás se puede hacer el approach o la forma, la metodología de diálogo indirecta, teniendo al senador Mitchell por parte de Estados Unidos en forma indirecta, pero también podría verse la forma no pública de discutir estos temas en forma directa entre israelíes y palestinos. Es decir, nos parece que en estos momentos, para superar el problema de no tener un liderazgo que esté calificado o a la altura de las circunstancias, lo que habría que ensayar es una metodología, una manera de aproximarse a la solución del conflicto que no sea la forma convencional, directa, donde hay una imposibilidad inmediata por la desconfianza crónica que existe entre los actores que están obligados a sentarse a pactar una solución política al conflicto. De manera que yo creo que el aporte que podríamos empezar a hacer desde este encuentro aquí en Cana es la construcción de escenarios que nos permita elaborar formas de aproximarse al diálogo, que permita superar los estilos de liderazgos actualmente existentes, de una ultraderecha por un lado y fundamentalismo islámico por otro, que son los dos extremos que dificultan este diálogo. Si eso por esa vía resulta difícil, entonces hay que buscar la forma más bien metodológica, la forma en que el diálogo puede llevarse a cabo más que la sustancia, porque la parte sustantiva resulta clara, la parte sustantiva es entendida y valorada por las partes razonables, es cómo llevar el diálogo hacia el centro, sacarlo de los extremos, llevarlo hacia el centro, y a nuestro modo de ver, llevarlo hacia el centro no es un problema de tipo sustantivo, sino un problema de carácter formal, la manera en que este diálogo puede llevarse a cabo. De manera que sugeriría que pudiéramos entonces trabajar en ese aspecto y poder presentar algunas sugerencias que permitan que este diálogo pueda continuar avanzando. De todas maneras, quiero terminar una vez más felicitando a los panelistas, porque sin duda alguna que nos han brindado una perspectiva novedosa, una perspectiva realista acerca de cómo está en estos momentos el conflicto de la región y saber que no hay solución militar, que tiene que ser una solución política negociada, y ya el gran desafío entonces es cómo dar con esa alternativa de solución en el momento en que justamente tiene que darse, porque el reloj está empezando a correr en contra de las posibilidades de esa solución política negociada. Así pues que a todos ustedes, felicidades y muchas gracias.